Stalin killed more people than Hitler. Let that sink in. And out of every executioner, every secret police chief, every monster he ever employed, there was only man Stalin himself was afraid of. At the Yalta Conference in 1945, Stalin sat across from the President of the United States, pointed at this man and said, "This is our Himmler." The room went dead silent. Franklin Roosevelt didn't laugh. Nobody did. By the end of this video, you'll know exactly why. You'll hear how he hunted women through the streets of Moscow like prey. How he signed a single piece of paper that buried 2,000 men in a forest. How he helped build the weapon that started the nuclear age, using slaves. And how, when his own comrades finally turned on him, they didn't just execute him. They made sure he suffered first. Stick around, because the way this man died is almost too disturbing to describe. But we're going to describe it anyway. If true stories like this one keep you up at night, hit subscribe and turn on that bell right now. Because the War Files exposes the monsters history tried to bury, and we post new files every single week. Comment the word "Mustar" below so we know you're locked in. Now let's go back to where this nightmare began, because trust me, it gets so much worse from here. March 1899. A quiet Georgian village tucked into the Caucasus Mountains. A baby boy is born to devout Christian parents. They name him Lavrentiy. They have no idea they've just raised the man Stalin himself would one day fear. Here's the twist nobody expects. This kid was brilliant. Top of his class in math and science, the type of student teachers bragged about. If revolution hadn't torn his country apart in 1917, Lavrentiy Beria might have become an engineer or a professor, or nobody you'd ever hear about. Instead, he became something far darker. When the Russian Empire collapsed that year, an 18-year-old Beria didn't hesitate. He joined the Bolsheviks. Within 2 years, he was working inside the intelligence service of a brand new republic, secretly loyal to the very revolutionaries trying to destroy the government paying his salary. By 1921, he had a permanent seat inside the Cheka, the original Soviet secret police, the organization every future intelligence agency in that country would trace its DNA back to. This is where he learned the tools he'd use for the rest of his life: fear, surveillance, and pain as policy. But this was still nothing. Keep watching, because what happened 3 years later is where the body count starts. 1924. Beria's own homeland, Georgia, rises up for independence. The Red Army crushes it, and Beria doesn't just take part in the crackdown. He commands it. 10,000 people executed. Not soldiers, not spies. Regular people who simply wanted their country back. Beria didn't lose a single night of sleep over it. This wasn't his breaking point. This was his job interview, and he passed with the highest score imaginable. 2 years later, he meets the man who will define the rest of his life, Joseph Stalin. Two Georgians, two men with a complete absence of conscience. Stalin sees a weapon he can sharpen. Beria sees a ladder made of corpses, and he starts climbing immediately. By 1931, he runs the entire Communist Party in Georgia. By 1934, he's in Moscow, sitting on the Central Committee, directing the government of the largest country on earth. Stalin is watching, and Stalin is impressed. Remember that name, the Ministry of Nightmares, because in 4 years, Beria is about to run it. August 1938. Stalin personally summons Beria to Moscow and hands him control of the NKVD, the machine behind the Soviet Union's prisons, police, and executions. People whispered a different name for it: the Ministry of Nightmares. Beria walks into an operation already drowning in blood. In the 2 years before he arrived, over 1 million Soviet citizens had been imprisoned or executed, labeled enemies of the people, for crimes as small as a rumor, a joke, a family connection. Farmers, scientists, war heroes, children of the wrong parents. Gone. An entire country was being taught that no one, not your neighbor, not your brother, not your own children, could be trusted. By late 1938, even Stalin realizes the bloodbath is destroying his own army and economy. So he does something chillingly simple. He blames it all on the previous NKVD chief, has him quietly executed too, and lets tens of thousands of prisoners walk free in a wave of propaganda called liberalization. Don't celebrate. This isn't the end of the horror. It's an upgrade. Beria doesn't slow the machine down. He makes it more efficient, more calculated, more theatrical. Survivors later testified about officials beaten until their spines shattered, about interrogations where the goal was never the truth, just the screaming. And multiple witnesses claimed Beria didn't just order the torture from behind a desk. Sometimes he watched. Sometimes he joined in personally. One of the first things he did as chief was compile a list of names. Hundreds of officials, including his own predecessor's family, marked for execution. Wives, brothers, teenage sons. Family connections meant nothing to him except more names on a page. Some of the interrogators Beria personally promoted became infamous for how far they were willing to go. One theater director was beaten so severely his spine was permanently damaged. A former high-ranking party official was dragged into Beria's own office, where a subordinate mutilated him while Beria reportedly sat back and watched, as if it were entertainment. This wasn't rogue behavior he punished. It was performance he rewarded. If you think that's disturbing, wait until you hear what he did to an entire forest in Poland. September 1939. Nazi Germany invades Poland. Weeks later, the Soviet Union invades from the other side. Poland is erased from the map, split between two dictators shaking hands over its corpse. Early 1940. Beria personally writes a memo to Stalin. Thousands of captured Polish officers, police, doctors, and priests are sitting in Soviet camps. Men who represented Poland's entire educated class. Beria's recommendation: execute every single one of them. Stalin signs it with a single stroke of a pen. Roughly 22,000 men are shot and dumped into mass graves. The most infamous hidden in the Katyn Forest. Among them military officers captured during the invasion, police officials, and a huge portion of Poland's intelligentsia. Doctors, professors, engineers, priests, all labeled as threats simply because they were educated enough to lead a resistance one day. And here's the part that should genuinely disturb you. For nearly 50 years, the Soviet Union blamed the Nazis for this massacre. When German forces later discovered the mass graves in 1943 and announced it to the world, Moscow immediately pointed the finger back at Berlin and stuck to that story for decades. 50 years of denial, 50 years of grieving families being told they were wrong about who killed their fathers. It wasn't until 1990, long after Beria himself was dead and buried, that Moscow finally admitted the truth. And the horror doesn't stop with Poland. This is just the warm-up act for what happens during the war itself. June 1941. Hitler betrays Stalin and invades the Soviet Union. Beria is handed control of the entire war economy, weapons production, aircraft manufacturing, and something even darker, the Gulag system. The labor camps existed before Beria. He's the one who turned them into an industrial machine. Millions of prisoners worked half to death building tanks, mining resources, constructing the machinery of Soviet survival. His own words, according to those who knew him, were chillingly simple: show him the man and he'd find him a crime. Then came the final horror of his wartime empire. When the Soviet Union raced to build an atomic bomb, it was Beria's NKVD running the project. Historians estimate the program required over 300,000 workers, including thousands of trained technicians and scientists working directly under the same secret police apparatus that could have them arrested overnight. Gulag prisoners by the tens of thousands were forced to mine uranium and build the test facilities with their bare hands. Many never told what they were even building. Exposed to radiation with no protection and no explanation. In August 1949, the bomb detonated in a remote test site. Beria had just dragged his country into the nuclear age, on the backs of slaves who never lived to understand what they'd built. By now you understand why Stalin called him, or Himmler. But nothing prepares you for what comes out at his trial. Here's where this story stops being about politics and starts becoming a horror film. By the early 1950s, Beria had built himself an empire of terror across Eastern Europe, hand-picking the leaders who answered to Moscow. But his own comrades were starting to turn, and in 1952, several officials he'd personally backed in Czechoslovakia were arrested and executed on manufactured charges. It was a warning. Even Beria wasn't untouchable anymore. Then, in March 1953, Stalin collapsed from a stroke. Beria was one of the first men in the room. According to Nikita Khrushchev's own account, Beria immediately started mocking the dying dictator, until Stalin briefly regained consciousness, at which point Beria dropped to his knees and kissed his hand like a devoted servant. The second Stalin faded again, witnesses say Beria's face lit up with something close to joy. Stalin died on March 5, 1953, and according to officials in the room, Beria practically bragged that he'd played a role in ending Stalin's life. You'd think that would make him untouchable. It made him a target. Beria became one of the two most powerful men left in the Soviet Union, but Khrushchev feared him more than he feared anyone alive. And when unrest exploded in East Germany that summer, rumors spread that Beria might trade Soviet control for his own political survival, willing to sell out the entire regime just to save himself. That was the final straw. June 26, 1953. Khrushchev calls a leadership meeting. Without warning, he stands up and accuses Beria of treason and espionage in front of the entire committee. Beria, completely blindsided, reportedly asks what on earth is going on. He turns to his closest ally for help, the one man he trusted above everyone. That man silently lowers his head and presses a hidden button under his desk. Armed soldiers burst through the door. The most feared man in the Soviet Union is arrested in seconds, unable to say a single word in his own defense. December 1953, Beria and 6 of his men stand trial in front of a closed military tribunal. No public defense, no appeal, one single day to decide his fate. And in that one day, the world finally learns who Lavrentiy Beria really was. He wasn't just a mass murderer. He wasn't just the architect of a terror state. Witnesses described a man who spent years hunting women through the streets of Moscow, spotting them from his car, having them brought to his residence, coercing them with promises to free imprisoned relatives. Those who resisted were sometimes arrested. Some were never seen again. One survivor who testified, a well-known Soviet actress, described being taken to Beria's residence under the promise that speaking with him could free her imprisoned family members. She said he made it chillingly clear that her cooperation was not optional. Decades later, construction workers installing streetlights near one of his former properties uncovered human remains buried in the garden. Young women who had simply vanished years earlier, never officially reported, never investigated, because who was going to investigate the head of the secret police? Even Stalin, the most ruthless dictator in modern history, didn't trust this man. When he learned his own teenage daughter had once been left alone in Beria's company, he called her immediately and ordered her to leave the building. Let that sink in. Stalin, a man who ordered the deaths of millions without blinking, was scared of what Beria might do to his own daughter. The tribunal delivers its verdict. Guilty of treason and counter-revolutionary crimes. Death effective immediately. His 6 co-defendants are executed together on the spot. But Beria's end is handled differently, deliberately drawn out, far from the swift and clean death he probably imagined for himself. By multiple historical accounts, he begged for his life in his final moments, sobbing and pleading. The same way his own predecessor had once begged in front of him, back when Beria found it entertaining. A single Soviet general carried out the execution personally. Khrushchev then ordered Beria's private archives destroyed completely, burning away any evidence of which other Soviet officials had once done his bidding, protecting men who'd built their careers on his terror. No memorial, no statue, no mourning. The most feared man in the Soviet Union died the same way he made thousands of others die, alone, terrified, and begging for a mercy he never once showed anyone else. To this day, historians still debate exactly how many people died because of decisions Beria made or signed off on. The purges, Katyn, the Gulag, the deportations. Some estimates run into the millions. What's not debated is this: for 3 decades, one man built his entire life around making sure that everyone around him, from factory workers to Stalin's own family, lived in fear of what he might do next. And in the end, it was that same fear that turned on him. That's the true story of Lavrentiy Beria, the man Stalin himself called, or Himmler, the architect of an empire built on fear, forced labor, and silence, and the monster even his own comrades were too afraid to let live another day. If this file kept you watching until the very last second, that's exactly what we do here at the War Files. Subscribe right now, hit that notification bell, and comment the name of the next historical monster you want us to expose. Because the next file we're dropping is even darker than this one. See you in the next file.